Hi students, this is our last video lecture for this short 1-week module, number 5, and here we're going to talk about the protists. So as big picture view of where we're at, we are now, if you look at this phylogenetic tree, this evolutionary tree, we really briefly talked about the bacteria, we talked about the archaea, the extremophiles, and we discussed how even if you look at this tree, you can tell the archaea are more closely related and in a tree that would be branched to the domain eukarya, right? The bacteria branch off on their own, but what was we once thought were bacteria were actually this new domain archaea. Carl Woese did that by looking at ribosomal RNA, the genetic material, and found that because of that, the archaea are more closely related to the eukarya than bacteria are to eukarya as well. So now we're focusing on this domain eukarya. We've moved on from the prokaryotes. And we're looking at the first kingdom, which are the protists. So remember, you have the domain, which is the broadest classification, and from there you can go to kingdom. And the domain eukarya has 4 kingdoms: protists, fungi, plants, and animals. We're looking at protists. And protists, they are thought, right? If you look at this branching, the protists evolved, if we think of time going from the most ancient time, so most distant time to present, the protists evolved first, and from the protists evolved the animals, the fungi, and the plants. So we're going to talk about protists that are animal-like, we're going to talk about protists that are plant-like, and we're going to talk about protists that are more fungi-like. So the protists are really simple eukaryotes, but they have very complex cells and they're very diverse. And so they all contain eukaryotic cells, right? We're done with the prokaryotes. So we're talking about protists all have eukaryotic cells. Protists can be single-celled or multicellular. We can have protists that are plant-like, which means they are autotrophic. They can photosynthesize, right? We can talk about protists that are animal-like, which means they consume. They're heterotrophs. They have to eat their organic matter, like the protozoans that we're going to talk about. And then we have fungi-like protists, which are the slime molds. And sorry, my picture got cut off there by me. So we're going to talk about these 3 groups. So the first group we're going to talk about are these algae or plant-like protists. So these are what we call autotroph. Auto means self. Troph means to feed. They can feed themselves because they breathe in CO2. Okay, unlike us that we breathe in oxygen, and they take that carbon and carbon dioxide and with energy from the sun make organic molecules like glucose, just like plants do. So we think the algae are the precursors to the plants. We characterize or we group algae based on the type of pigment. A pigment refers to a molecule that algae and plants have that can absorb the energy and light. Pigments are used to photosynthesize. They absorb certain wavelengths, and the wavelength that they do not absorb is reflected, and that's what we see. So a plant that looks green is not absorbing the green wavelength. They're reflecting it, and that's why it looks like it's green. So we categorize algae into red algae because they have pigments, red pigments, brown algae, and green algae. We also talk about certain diatoms that are autotrophic, and we're not going to talk too much about this. What's neat about these, we'll see them maybe in lab. They have silica in their cell walls. That's this like a glass-like material, and so when you look at them, if you see this picture, they look very geometric because they actually have glass-like cell walls. And then there's dinoflagellates that are these algae that have 2 flagella. So we categorize them algae based on their pigments. There's diatoms that are also autotrophic, and then there's the dinoflagellates. All right, so in terms of algae, we have the green algae, which are very closely related to plants. They have the same pigment as plants called chlorophyll. They have cellulose in their cell wall. Remember from beginning of the semester, cellulose is like fiber. Plants have that in cell wall. Okay, so do these green algae. And just like plants, they store excess glucose as starch. This is a green algae you may be familiar with if you ever go to like a sushi restaurant and eat seaweed salad, which is one of my family's favorites. It comes from this protist, this ulva, which is often called the sea lettuce, and these are an example of multicellular algae. That's a green algae. Another green algae is this volvox, which is actually colonial, meaning each of these is a single-celled organism, but they form a colony. They come together and they help each other. And hopefully we'll view this in lab. And then there's red algae. Red algae is also what makes agar. So if you think of the capsules and pills that sometimes you can open, those are agar capsules. We're going to work with plates in lab, nutrient plates, and those are made out of agar. So also the wraps for sushi come from red algae as well. Another type of algae is brown algae. Remember, we're categorizing these based on their pigments. These are some of the largest, right? The giant kelp that can be hundreds of meters in length. Next, another type of algae are these dinoflagellates. They have flagella. They're single-celled. They make up the plankton, the phytoplankton in water that is like basically the bottom, the base of the food chain in a lot of aquatic ecosystems, right? Like filter feeders eat the phytoplankton, and then little fish eat those, and so on and so forth. So they're really what provide the organic matter for all the living things in a lot of aquatic environments. If you've ever heard like of a red tide, that's due to an excess of growth of a certain dinoflagellates. Okay, so we're finished now with the algae protists, right? Those were the autotrophic or photosynthetic ones. Now we're going to go to the protists that are animal-like. And those are the pro means before, zoo means animal. Protozoans are before the animals. Sorry, that's my dog. Kiwi. Sorry. So these are animal-like protists before the animals. Animals evolved from these. So if they're animal-like, they're not going to photosynthesize. So we categorize them by how they move generally. So there are the flagella moving ones. There are ones that move by something called a pseudopod, which here this picture, if you've ever heard of an amoeba, amoebas kind of, these parts here are called pseudopods, and they push cytoplasm into it, and those parts extend, and that's how they move. And then there's ones that have cilia. So cilia are along, like this is a picture of a paramecium, along all their cell here, and these are all single-celled, I may add, but cilia are different than flagella, right? Flagella usually just have a few in their long. Cilia are tons, and they're smaller. And I will add that these protozoans are single-celled, but those cells are very complex. Usually those cells have almost like a digestive system in their vacuoles. They have a way to move. They have a way to ingest food, right? So even though they're only single-celled, they're very complex. We're not going to really talk about these spore formers much today. Some are free-living, all others are parasitic. This one is one that's a flagellate. It has a flagellum. It's trypanosomos. It causes African sleeping sickness, which when you're infected by this, they basically get in your nervous system and you fall asleep and eventually you die. There are other flagellates that cause diarrhea, like You've heard of giardia, right? It can be found in water, and that can cause you to get really sick from diarrhea. So those are some examples of the flagellates. Remember, we're categorizing these protozoans by how they move. The other category of them are those that have those pseudopods, right? So protozoans with pseudopods. Pseudo means false or fake. Pod means limb, right? So these are false-limbed. An amoeba is an example of one. They move with the pseudopods. So this is like a pseudopod and extends, and eventually it wraps around the organic matter that they're trying to ingest, and by endocytosis, it takes it into its cell. Others move by cilia. This is a paramecium. And you know what's crazy about it? This is what I mean by they're single-celled, but they're super complex. These paramecium, that is a one-celled organism, has an oral groove, kind of like a mouth, right? A gullet, which is kind of like the stomach, and an anal pore where it releases materials out and has a contractile vacuole with it. So that's it has a way to move, it has a way to take in food, to release it, to digest. That's pretty complex for a single-celled. All right, so what have we covered? We've covered the protists, right? These are eukaryotic celled organisms, single-celled or multi-celled. We started with the algae that are categorized basically on their pigments, right? Then we've talked about the protozoans, which are mostly single-celled heterotrophs. And now, lastly, we're just going to briefly mention that there's another type of protist that gave rise to fungi, because you'll find that fungi are decomposed, are called slime molds. So these are usually multicellular. They are decomposers because they feed on dead or decaying matter or bacteria. You can even see sometimes in people's yards this bright yellow color that's kind of growing either like within the mulch or the ground. And so these aren't photosynthetic, even though they look bright colored, right? These are heterotrophs. They have to consume their organic material. All right, so that's it for the protists. There are the algae that are plant-like. We categorize them by their pigment. These can be single-celled or multicellular. We have the protozoan before the animal. These are animal-like. They're mostly single-celled, and we characterize them by how they move, either flagella, pseudopods, or cilia. And then we have the slime molds that decompose, feed usually on bacteria or other organic matter, or algae and protozoans. Take care, everyone.